Hello, everyone. I think we're going to get started. Good afternoon. Welcome to the library's Meet the Author series. Thank you so much for being here today. I wanted to start off by thanking members of the library's Programming and Communications Committee for their work, and to the NU Department of Economics for your co-sponsorship, as well as to our good partners, the bookstore. I hope that you will consider supporting our Meet the Author programs by becoming a library supporter. We are filming today's program. It will be broadcast on YouTube and the university's iTunes channel. So just so you know, we are recording this. And we also appreciate feedback. So you might have gotten, did people get comment cards when you walked in? So if you could please take a few moments to fill those out, that really helps to inform the kind of programming we bring in for you. We're going to get started. I'd like to introduce Professor John Quokka. Dr. Quokka is the Neil F. Finnegan Distinguished Professor of Economics at Northeastern. And he has written a book, The Antitrust Revolution, with L.J. White. It's a compilation of case studies of major antitrust proceedings, and it is in the 4th edition. Dr. Quokka has authored Power Structure, a study of public versus private ownership, vertical integration, and competition in the U.S. electrical industry. He received his A.B. in economics from Brown and his Ph.D. in economics from UPenn. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Maria. The topic of today's discussion is the electricity industry. 20 years ago, such a talk, I think, would have drawn an interested audience of about 5 people. Today, this industry in this country and everywhere is really at the intersection of several powerful forces. The concern over carbon emissions, the need for energy conservation, the opportunities presented by new technologies, and ultimately the restructuring of the industry and the profound change in thinking that will be required to make any of these things happen. A few months ago, I had the opportunity to read an advanced copy of a book called Smart Power, Climate Change, the Smart Grid, and the Future of Electric Utilities. The book addresses all of these issues with a scholar's understanding of the underlying economics, an engineer's grasp of the technical issues, a futurist's ability to envision the direction of emerging forces, and a policymaker's nitty-gritty understanding of how to get things done. It's a rare book, and I urge then and urge anyone interested in these issues to read it. And today we're very fortunate to have with us the author of that book, Peter Fox-Penner. I've known Peter for many years, but it wasn't until I read his bio that I realized he actually combined all of the traits I just mentioned: scholar, engineer, futurist, and policymaker. Peter got his BA in electrical engineering, his master's in mechanical engineering, his PhD in economics. He's taught and worked in academia. He has served in the government, one position being Deputy Assistant Director at the Department of Energy. He's worked in consulting, most recently as chairman of the Brattle Group, a prominent energy consulting practice with offices here in Cambridge and elsewhere. And he's a prolific author and commentator on issues in electricity, natural gas, telecom, petroleum, and energy policy generally. Peter is an unusual person in my experience in that he is always worth listening to and reading. And we're fortunate to have him here today to visit us to talk about his new book. I want to thank several people for making this happen: Kathy Downey in our economics department, Maria Carpenter and Emily Sabo in the library's authors program, and Heidi Bishop with Brattle Group. As I understand it, Peter will talk for 20 or 30 minutes and then be happy to take your questions. And with that, would you please join me in welcoming Peter Fox-Penner.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that nice introduction, John, and Maria as well. I would like to begin by thanking everyone that Maria and John thanked It's a long list, and I probably would get it wrong, but it takes many hands to make an event like this come off. And I must say, when I die and am reincarnated and get to go back to college again, I think I want to come to Northeastern. Not only is it a beautiful campus, but you serve free food at lunch, and in a beautiful library with interesting talks. And I don't remember that when I was in school. I've also always wanted to be on iTunes. So this may be my only shot at it. And I think I've just notched up a degree in coolness in the eyes of my 16-year-old daughter. So thank you, Northeastern, for that very, very much. For everything else, there's MasterCard, but that's very precious to me. Let me begin by talking a little bit about why I wrote this book. It's kind of a funny story, like many books. About 5 years ago, I was, I'm always getting a little bored and looking for some windmill to tilt after. And I was also just despondent over the state of American energy policy. I thought we were going backwards, leading the world backwards on global climate change, are more dependent than ever on oil, and really going nowhere on all of the things that I thought were important on a good national energy policy. So I started to try to draft a book proposal and went through many, many versions and many rejections from many publishers, just like the Beatles. But in the meantime, along came the election, and President Obama was elected on a platform, an energy policy platform, that I thought was extremely progressive, extremely strong, I thought just right for the country. And I was pleasantly surprised to see him elected without backlash against that platform, and for him to basically move firmly in all of the directions that he promised in his campaign. And you can go back and look at all the campaign documents and map them to the strategies. Meanwhile, at my consulting company, the Brattle Group, we had gotten an assignment from the Edison Foundation, which is the kind of research foundation from all the electric utilities. And they asked us to do a report on the investment needs for the power industry looking out over a long period of time. And it was mainly sort of oriented towards Wall Street. It wasn't a particularly policy-directed exercise. It was just like, give us an idea of how much money we're going to have to raise. And while I'd been thinking over and over about energy policy and how it was now dramatically changing direction under Obama, I was completing this assignment. And the book, just in one of those rare moments in life, it just hit me in a flash, the entire book, really, the whole arc of the book. And the flash was that the good energy policies that I think the country was now in the process of adopting and is in the process of adopting, which I'll talk about, including global climate policies, the promotion of electric vehicles, much stronger energy efficiency policies. All those policies could be derailed because the utility industry is, the electric power industry in particular, is really an anchor of all those policies. And that the era that the electric power industry is heading into is one of unprecedented potential tumult, challenge, and sort of potential disarray. And that if the industry enters a prolonged period of turmoil, it will actually hurt our ability to achieve those policies. So the real overarching goal for the book is sort of to try to anticipate and prevent a regulatory and financial period of turmoil, a backlash in the economy as a whole that could harm our energy policy. And in a nutshell, the book concludes that in order to avoid these problems, the industry has to change very dramatically into one of two forms that I think are sustainable And I mean that not only in the current most common use of the term, that is environmentally sustainable, although that's very much a part of it, but also economically and financially and politically sustainable as well. So let me now begin by briefly reviewing the main challenges that are hitting the power industry. And these challenges are by far the largest change vectors that have ever hit this industry since it was born 120 years ago. The first one, of course, is global climate change. I firmly believe that no matter what happens in the US Congress in the next 60 or 90 days, that the United States will soon place a declining limit on utility carbon emissions, declining towards the 80% reduction by 2050. And one way or another, we will adopt that, most likely with some form of cap and trade system applying to the utilities. And I'm certainly a strong advocate of that. I think that it is very important that we do that, not simply for the planet and our own sort of moral leadership and moral responsibilities as the world's last remaining superpower, but also it has become compelling for our economy, for job growth, and it's even become an imperative for the utility industry itself. One of the biggest uncertainties overhanging utilities right now is what the rules of the road are going to be regarding their climate emissions. And at Brattle Group, in my consulting job, we work for many, many utilities, and it's quite clear that they feel that it is no longer in their advantage to delay determining the rules of the road. It's hampering their ability to plan, hampering their ability to invest, raising their long-term costs. And so it's the right thing to do even for the industry. But while it is the right thing to do, it is going to have a gigantic impact on the industry. This is one of the things we looked at in the Edison Foundation study, and there are many, many other studies. And they all show that the industry is going to need to spend somewhere between, I think, $500 billion and $1 trillion changing out much of our power plant fleet over the next 30 years. And that's a gigantic transformation of its capital stock. It's the largest investment program that any energy sector has undertaken on a concerted basis. Now, I don't have any unique ability to forecast exactly what sort of power plants we're going to need to install. There are many different mixtures of plants that can get us to the 80% reduction by 2050. And of course, the trajectory will be negotiated and set in national climate policies and subsequent rulings and things like that. But if you look at the book, I simply review a number of studies of this, and it is interesting to see that there are many different opinions about what that mix will be. My conclusion is that there are a number of options that are emerging that are workable, and that that as long as you make the requisite investment, this is a solvable problem. And that would, I think, even include low-carbon coal sources, where you can sequester the emissions from coal-fired power plants, which if I had to guess, I think will probably pan out and become economic over time. New nuclear plants may also be in the mix, and certainly many forms of renewables. So I think there are a number of ways to skin the cat, and I don't know exactly which ways we will do it. And I think one of the advantages of a cap-and-trade system or any other well-designed climate policy is it will let the industry and the marketplace sort that out in the lowest cost manner. But regardless of how it gets sorted out, it is a monumental investment challenge. The second major impact factor on the utilities is the necessity for greater energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is the single most important element of a successful national energy policy and a successful national climate policy. And it's also the single best element of that policy from the standpoint of rebuilding our economy, our technology base, our green jobs base, and getting our economy out of this horrible recession that we're in. Or maybe we're no longer in it, but it still feels like it in too many parts of America. The issue with energy efficiency, though, is that it takes capital. Energy efficiency is inherently something where you need to spend a lot of money up front, and you reap the savings over time. And in my experience over decades of working in energy policy, energy efficiency advances when low-cost capital is made available to the people who need it and can put it to work, whether it's insulating a building like this, the beautiful Snell Library, insulating our homes, changing out our lights and fixtures, and putting in more efficient appliances. It's always a question of spending more now and reaping the savings over time. And that people need access to capital, particularly most American households now, and even businesses who are basically not flush with capital, I guess I will say. To a large extent carrying historically unprecedented amounts of debt. So one excellent way to provide this capital is through the utility industry. The utility industry is capital intensive. Professor Quokka can tell us about that. And it's very good at raising capital. It has relatively low costs in doing that. But for utilities to lead the energy efficiency mission, you have to confront a real tension. We're asking utilities to, in essence, finance lower profits, lower sales and lower profits. And that conflict has been with us with increasing levels of strength ever since the 70s, when the idea of energy efficiency as a national policy was born, but it's getting proportionately larger and more important. As we have moved down that path over the last 30 years, because of this tension between utility shareholder profits and the advantages of utilities in doing energy efficiency, which, by the way, go beyond their ability to spend capital. They also have other advantages in helping with energy efficiency. We've kind of woven a very complex web of energy efficiency policies in this country that varies quite a lot from state to state and region to region, even city to city. In some parts of the country, including in New England, even to a large extent here in the city of Boston, you have a lot of state and local government leadership, and you have a willingness for the state and local entities to make capital available to people at reasonable costs and facilitate energy efficiency. But basically, there is a patchwork quilt of state and local policies across the country, and also something of a patchwork quilt of utility policies varying across the country. And we also use codes and standards, which also vary a lot across the country. So you have a very complex system that is nowhere near maximizing our energy efficiency resource, and really with no clear national leadership on it. One of the things that I think is critically important as we enter this era of much better energy policies and hopefully global climate leadership rather than followership is to to get more clarity in our energy efficiency policies, which in simple terms mean figure out who's in charge, who's driving the bus, and make sure that they are well funded and they have all the tools and resources they need to maximize our energy efficiency. Now, as I said, if utilities are doing it, there's a direct conflict between them and their shareholder profits as we've now conceived our sector and we now regulate it and have set it up. But one of the things that hit me in this Edison Foundation study is that even before you get to energy efficiency policies, one of the unique moments that, one of the unique aspects of the moment that we're in with utilities is that what once was a very fast-growing industry is becoming a almost zero growth sector. And well, I want to skip over some of these slides in the interest of making sure that we've got enough time for questions. You can see all these in the book. This one I want to take a moment to show you. These are forecasts of total electric utility industry sales in billion kilowatt hours out through 2030. That's what's on the bottom of the slide. And the top line shows what electricity sales would be through 2030 if they kept going at the rate they were going from 2000 to 2008, which is largely before this last recession. And as you can see from the slide, they were growing at about 1% a year. Now that's already the lowest level of sales growth since the industry was born. It has never grown that slowly anywhere ever before in history. It used to, when I was the age of the undergrads in this room, it was growing at 7% a year, doubling every 10 years. So it's already pretty low. But the next line down, which is tan, is the official forecast of the United States. The Energy Information Administration, or EIA, which is a unit of the Department of Energy, does the nation's official energy forecast. And their latest one, which is only a few months old, shows even slower growth than we have been growing. And one of the actually statutory requirements on EIA is that their forecast of growth is not allowed to factor in any rule, policy, or regulation that is not yet in force, that is not yet the law of the land, which means it's not factoring in global climate legislation. And global climate legislation, I believe, will significantly further lower the rate of sales growth because, number one, I think electricity prices are going to rise a little more than is built into EIA's assumptions. And like any product, when you raise electricity prices a little bit, people use less of it. That's well established. And so that, in my opinion, is a significant over-forecast of electricity use. Below it, you'll see a kind of a light blue line that's a little bit of an improvement on EIA. It's a study that we contributed to done by the Electric Power Research Institute, abbreviated EPRI. And in it, we began with EIA's forecast, and we said, well, what if utilities do a little bit more in energy efficiency? Even significantly more, not maybe as much as they possibly could do, but a fair amount more. And that study showed that you drop sales even further. One of the things that I really wanted to do in this book, because I was worried about this, and this was all part of this flash, is that looking at all these forecasts, I thought that they were very possibly over-predicting sales as low as their sales growth rates were. That something was just telling me that they're leaving out a lot of policies. They're leaving out the fact that we're going to have to invest $500 billion, which is going to raise prices, and some other factors. And if you look at Chapter 3 of the book and Appendix A, there's an analysis in there which leads me to conclude in the book that it's quite possible, not guaranteed, but it's a very plausible outcome to see sales down at only 0.16% a year, which is just about flat. That's the bottom line there. And that includes, by the way, a pretty significant addition of plug-in electric vehicles. 10 million vehicles on the road by 2030, and about 25 billion kilowatt hours used for electric vehicles, which is close to about the most aggressive forecast. Now, I think electric vehicles will continue to penetrate and even bring sales up, but there are so many things in the economy that we can make more efficient, that we can offset all of the power needed by electric vehicles over time periods like this. So here we have an electric industry. I think you're getting the picture now. We have an industry that has to invest between $500 billion and $1 trillion, and its sales aren't going up. And that's a bit of a financial challenge even here in America. But there's more. If you put all of this aside, there is another revolution going on in the power industry that amplifies all of this, and even by itself, I think, would force the industry to have to change dramatically. And that's the smart grid. Now, the smart grid can be defined in many, many different ways, and I define it simply as the application of modern information technology to the control of the power grid from end to end, and our own control over our own power use. The smart grid will eventually, when it's fully developed, allow all of us as individual electric customers to exercise tremendous control over our power use, much more than we have now. And we'll have much more information about our power use. We'll be able to basically determine in our own home or in our office which device is using how much power. We'll be able to monitor it. It'll tell us when it burns out, just like you see in some of your car dashboards these days, or tell us when it's not working properly. We'll be able to program it so that it's controlled either by hourly prices that come on a signal from the power company, or we'll be able to give its control over to, say, a management agent, where we just something like probably this building and my building in Washington has a management agent, and actually they have a computer up in the penthouse that manages the energy systems of the building. They don't manage them to hourly price signals, but they could. They just don't. And that technology, which is very cumbersome and takes a lot of programming and sits on a workstation, could be decentralized and distributed and put on your iPhones. And ultimately, it will be. This is a very positive development from the standpoint of energy efficiency and making the grid more efficient, making it more reliable, and giving us all much more control over it. But the whole utility industry's business model and regulatory model and financial model is built on a much simpler relationship with customers. I'll wager not a single person in this room has ever known and can say the name of an employee of their local power company or put that name to a face. All you do is you get a bill every month and you send them a check. That's the extent of your interaction with your utility today. But when the utility could be managing everything in your house, or you could be letting it manage everything in your house, you could have a much more complicated arrangement with it, many more products and prices. And the current business model of the utility is not set up for that. So while these changes are all excellent, in kind of the long-term policy sense, I don't think the current industry can survive with its current business model. So in the final third of the book, and the final part of my talk here, I will talk a little bit about the ways that the industry can evolve into a more sustainable posture. Now, to do that, I introduce this notion of a triad, and it sounds a little Star Trek to me, and I wish I could have thought of a better name. It'll sound good on iTunes. But the idea here is that one thing I have observed in many decades watching regulated energy industries all over the world, and this is most true of regulated electric utilities, The industry structure, by which I mean as an economist, the number and type of firms, the products that they sell, are they vertically integrated? Is there a single firm sort of from cradle to grave? Or are there many firms along the supply chain? All of those things are what economists call structure. And the structure maps into the products, right? It's the products at the boundary of the firm that are traded to who's ever next along the line of production, or traded horizontally between firms. So the structure and product mix is inseparable from the way we regulate a firm and the way you can blend competition in markets or deregulation into the industry. And then the business model of the firm is inextricably tied to all those other elements of the triad. All of these have to map together, and they have to be economically sustainable, financially sustainable, and politically sustainable to work. The traditional industry triad is the one we're all familiar with, where the power companies look mostly like the ones that you have lived with your whole life. In Massachusetts, there is retail choice, so there has been one big change in the structure, but it isn't even as big a change as we thought it was going to be. There's still quite pervasive regulation over the industry. Mostly the products have changed very little. Regulation has not changed that much, and the business model so far has not changed that much. The underpinning of the utility business model is still, even for deregulated retailers and nonprofit utilities, is sell as much as you can and sell it as cheap as you can. It's still a commodity mindset. This triad, the one I just described, the traditional triad, it really served us well for 100 years until the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, somewhere in there. And certainly doesn't serve us well today, because the current objectives that we ask of the industry are very different. Instead of asking it to give us as much power as it can give us, as cheaply as it can give us, we ask the industry to be as efficient as possible. In essence, to give us as much value and service, but with as few kilowatt hours as possible, because every kilowatt hour either uses carbon, or at least it's going to cost us a lot of money to take the carbon out. So we want to do more with less. We want to take the carbon out. We want new green technologies and the industries of the future and the jobs of the future. And we want to install the smart grid, which is very expensive and very disruptive. So I think we need a new triad. And that's really, in essence, the theme of the book. And I don't see the future, a sustainable future, as simply as one of deregulation or re-regulation. Those terms are often thrown about in Washington, where I live, too often, really. But I see a much more complicated blend of regulation and market forces and firm boundaries. And I also see two different possible paths, which each of which have some pros and cons, and each of which might turn out to be a viable, sustainable triad. So let me just show them to you, and then we can close down and get to some questions here. Let's see if this will work here. No? How about this? Let me get out of that. I'm trying to go down one. It worked last time. Here we go. There we go. Thanks. Okay, the first alternative new future for the industry is a utility I call the Smart Integrator. You need to have clever titles for future industry forms, especially if you want to be on iTunes. So the Smart Integrator is just a name I give to a utility that operates the power grid, and it operates in a very efficient and intelligent and smart way, implements all this smart grid technology. But much like the distribution utilities here in Massachusetts today, it doesn't really get involved in retail sales of any or retail services. It ends at the border of your fuse box or breaker box. And it basically says, even with this smart grid and all of these new services and technologies and things like that, the market's just going to have to figure that out. My job is to give grid services to whoever it is and whatever it is that's plugging into me, and to charge for that at a regulated tariff, because these smart integrators are going to be, they're going to own the wires. There's going to be pretty much a single set of wires to all of our houses, I think, throughout the period I look at through 2050. The grid will not be going away. Regulation of that grid won't be going away, but this grid will be charged with providing all of this services, the smart grid services that the industry needs and consumers need, including a lot of information. I mentioned the information on hourly prices. Those are going to have to be provided to everybody, and potentially lots of other information about your own usage and other things that system conditions, local system conditions, more distant conditions, lots and lots of information that will go hand in hand with your energy use decisions. All of those services that it provides will be provided really at regulated tariffs. And one of the things that one of the conclusions that I really came to, and the main concerns that motivated the book, is that regulating this kind of grid with a whole raft of new services is going to be quite a complex challenge. A lot of the service, we all envision a future in which you can plug solar panels and electric cars and batteries and all those sorts of things into the grid. But as an electric power economist, I can tell you that when you stand back and you put yourself in the shoes of the grid and the regulator of that grid, and you say, you know, I'm going to allow all sorts of new services on my grid. I'm going to allow charging of cars at different times and discharging of cars at different times and different services from those batteries. I'm also going to allow people to plug in all sorts of different renewable power devices that have very different attributes. And I'm not going to do that for free. I have to charge for that, because doing that imposes costs on the whole system. Costs me money to do all of that stuff. I need to set a fair price for that. Well, that's when they come to economic consultants like us and say, gee, well, what's the right price for that? Well, we're starting to work on that. And I think those are very hard questions. And they're not just the kind of questions that are going to take a couple of weeks to work out. I think they're going to take more like a couple of decades to work out. And my conclusion about the Smart Integrator model is that it makes a lot of sense. It brings a lot of the advantages that we hoped the first era of deregulation would bring to the power grid, and brought to a very, very modest degree. But it really expands the scope for markets and innovation, but it presents the regulated segment of the system with extraordinarily complex regulatory challenges, some of which we can't even quite foresee yet, but here's a little list of them to give you an idea of it. I talked about pricing access to the local network. There's going to have to be lots of local network upgrade decisions and allocating their costs. You have to decide which parts of the network are going to be expanded, much like deciding which cell phone towers, where you're going to build a new cell phone tower, and how much is it going to cost. There's a lot of customer data and privacy issues that people are getting increasingly concerned about. There are cybersecurity issues with the smart grid that are extremely complex. And when you have the regulated power grid sending all this information and getting a lot of information back from this very complex and dynamic deregulated segment, that grid is going to want to be absolutely certain that among all of this ocean of information coming into it, there are no hackers and bad actors and things like that. There's already starting to be consumer backlash over the cost of smart grid investments, and I think a potential backlash over the cost of low carbon investments as a whole. And of course, we talked about energy efficiency and the need to allocate its costs as well. So the other model, future model, if I can work this again, is something I called the energy service utility. And this is almost the mirror image of the Smart Integrator. Here, the utilities do something that's quite different than we have here in Massachusetts, although it wasn't so long ago that they were a little bit like this here. They integrate forward into becoming, in essence, service advisors and almost consultants to homeowners and business owners, to the point of even helping to finance their energy efficiency hardware. It's much like you could hire a consultant today, and there is an active marketplace for energy consultants who will come in and look at a building like this and take engineering measurements and give advice on what sort of new technologies could be installed, and insulation and new windows and so on and so forth, how much it'll cost, how long it will take to get a payback on those. And there are some companies that will even borrow the money and finance those for you and share the savings with you and eventually pay those investments back. Utilities could adopt something like that model on a very broad scale basis. It's an idea that really began in the 70s with Amory Lovins and Roger Sant and others. And it's much more radical than the Smart Integrator model, because it's really taking utilities back to their original roots. In the 1880s, when they began, that's what utilities did. Nowadays, it's been so long since utilities did any more than sort of drop the power in your fuse box, and whatever happened in your house was your business, that it would be a real paradigm shift for them, and I think a real change in our whole culture. I might not have even explored this, but when I was writing the book and thinking about this, I thought that this model has some advantages. I think that it's possible that this model would do better for energy efficiency policy. But in addition, when I talked to a bunch of utility CEOs, they were really intrigued by this model. They don't so much like having to retreat into being invisible backbone providers, like the internet backbone providers. So I don't know which of these two models will ultimately prevail, and it could be that we have some hybrid in between them. I think it will be many, many decades before one of them triumphs and becomes monolithic. But I do think and hope that by raising them with you today and with policymakers in Washington and people in the industry, that I will get the industry and its regulators preparing for change. Because I think the status quo is not an option. We need to go in one of these two directions, and if we can just start the dialogue on which one of these things is best for the country, is sustainable for the industry, will get us to our energy policy goals, will be financed by Wall Street, meets all those conditions, I will feel like Smart Power has made a small contribution to it. There's one or two other specific recommendations in the book, and I'll just mention one of them in closing, and that is that because these changes are so wrenching for the industry and are going to change regulation so much and the role of regulators so much, I suggest that we create an academy for energy regulators, financed by the federal government, of course, and that energy regulators go to this and even get accredited, because these challenges require an understanding of technology and economics and lots of other things that would strain anyone. I think energy regulators are very smart, very hardworking, and I think if you talk to any of them, they're just flooded with information now, and they know that the political forces on them are only growing. To do a good job of guiding us through this transition, they sort of need a safe haven, an academic safe haven that's a little bit depoliticized and has the absolute best and cutting edge information available to them, so that they can at least do their best to understand what's going on and make the best decisions and help this transition. So with that, I thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to your questions, and I look forward to an ongoing dialogue on this topic that I think will be with us for many years to come. For those of you who are students going into the energy field, your assignment is to figure this out. And you have the next 20 or 30 years. But please help, because I think we'll need it. Thank you very much. Oh, are there any countries or areas of this country that have anticipated this? Yes, as to areas of the United States. Outside the United States, there are some countries that have much better and more successful energy policies than us, but it's very difficult to transplant those into the United States, in my opinion, because they come out of political systems and cultures that are so different than ours that I've never seen it get much traction to say, oh, such and such a country does this, why can't we just go and do it? But I think to a greater extent, we can look at other parts of the United States and learn from them. Up in Vermont, there is and in California, you have two states that have done very, very good on energy efficiency with different models. In Vermont, it's really a state agency that leads the implementation of energy efficiency. It happens that I think they get their money mostly from utilities. So they raise the money from utilities, and then the state sort of helps deploy it. But that's an ambitious and a successful model. The state of California uses the utilities themselves and actually gives the utilities a profit on the energy efficiency that they adopt. And as a result, many of you know this, in the state of California, the use of electricity per person has not gone up in 20 years over the addition of all of these iPods and cell phones and all the electronics we have in our homes, flat screen TVs, which use quite a lot of power. The state has kept per capita electricity consumption flat, and with a growing population, and it now thinks it will flatten out electricity use, period. So on energy efficiency, we have some good models. On smart grid, we have some leading utilities that are being very ambitious about this. The city of Austin, Boulder, Colorado, and a few other places, and similarly with other elements. Yes, sir.
As one who's been privileged to analyze every climate change bill that's come through the Congress, one of the things when you read these pieces of legislation, as I'm sure you have, there's no systematic approach to any of these cap and trade policies. This is basically a lot of funding that basically is giving back to various constituents and stakeholders without any sort of systemic view of the energy environmental system. I'm wondering how you get something like this started. It seems to me that these little anecdotal pockets around the country aren't going to work because you need something that's country size. So how do you get something like this? The grid is even mentioned in these climate change bills. In no place.
I think you get something that this started by writing a book about it. Hopefully that leads to a snowball effect. I do see signs of change. The industry itself is holding workshops that are doing future visioning exercises, the kinds of which I've never, ever seen it do. So the industry is starting to do this. I think building awareness of this at the federal level is very important, because I would like to see the federal government lead this by establishing this academy and getting state regulators in a depoliticized environment with the leading thinkers in the industry, academics, good industry economists like John, and get the dialogue going. I think that's the most important path forward. Yes, in the back?
You mentioned global climate legislation, and I'm just wondering how realistic you think it is to expect the United States to sign on and follow global climate legislation, granted its poor track record. And even if the current administration is excited about clean energy, what's not to say that the next administration, possibly across the aisle, will not reverse energy policy or renege on climate legislation signed abroad.
Okay, there are two questions there. One is, do I think the U.S. would follow, quote, global climate legislation? And second of all, is there a possibility that the energy policies will shift with a different change of administration? As to the first one, there might be a little bit of misstatement on my part. When I say the United States will adopt global climate policies, or synonymously national climate policies, what I mean is we'll pass our own national law on climate change. The problem is global, of course. That's why we call it global climate change. But what I'm talking about is a United States law. I believe we will pass a United States law, and I don't believe it will be repealed no matter who wins any future presidential election. And I certainly hope so, but I also honestly don't believe so. So we're not talking about a treaty or anything like that. I think we will pass our own law. I think our own law will be largely in harmony with what all the nations of the world need to do, and eventually we will need further harmonization. It's one of the reasons why I like cap and trade. And I think as to energy policies changing with another administration, yes, we've seen it happen before. We see it happen again. But I think once a new triad like this gets established, it isn't changed that much by national energy policies. The current triad has, through many, many changes of presidential administrations and energy policies, it kind of goes along and does its thing. And I'm hopeful the new triad will do that too, once we get it established. Yes, in the yellow shirt.
The Smart Integrator concept that you were talking about, I guess I was trying to understand, so what would you imagine they would be doing that would be different than, say, like in ISO New England, or like a utility like National Grid that's mostly just transmission-based as opposed to generation-based?
Right. Well, first of all, the power grid has, so you might say, four major segments. There's the generators, the transmission segment, which are the big high voltage lines, the ones that are on those big crisscross towers that you drive under on the expressways. Then there is the distribution system, which goes from those high voltage towers in the smaller lines that come to buildings like this. That's the distribution system. And then there's everything that happens beyond the meter. You could call that retailing and so on and so forth. It's true National Grid operates all the high voltage lines. They also, in this area, operate the distribution system. The difference between what they're doing in that transmission and distribution system now and what they'll do when the smart grid's fully installed is, for them, just them, it's more a question of more sophistication and complexity. Right now, they operate the system with relatively simple controls compared to the ones that they could have if they put the latest sensors and computers and control circuits on, particularly in the distribution system. And when you put much greater sensors, controls, and information in the distribution system, you can run it more efficiently, you can run it more reliably, and you can send all this information to customers. Right now, you sit in your home, You can look up on the internet what power is selling for in New England every hour, but you can't look, there's no way for you to know. You'd need a supercomputer to figure out what the value of power at your house was that hour. They'll put in that supercomputer and they'll get you that information, but you don't have it right now. So I hope that paints a little bit of a picture of what will be different. Yes, in the back.
You mentioned some security issues of the smart grid. Would it be, in your opinion, any more or less secure than what we have right now?
The question is, will the grid be less secure or more secure than the one we have now in a cybersecurity sense when we have the smart grid? That's an excellent question to which I have to say I don't know. But what we're sure of is this. The current grid that we have, it's certain, we know that it's been hacked. There's a growing unclassified literature about how often it's been hacked. It's been hacked by people in China and lots of other places. And they may have even inserted these bots that are going to, that they can activate and take down the grid. But the fact that very few of us have portals into it means that at least there are limited points of cyber access. And there's a funny thing about the current grid that almost helps cybersecurity, and that is because the grid's kind of grown up bit by bit and never been standardized, even within a single utility, there are a dozen different computer systems that really don't talk to each other. This is one thing that people say is a real problem and why it doesn't run as efficiently. But interestingly, that makes it harder to hack. Even inside the utility, the systems don't talk to each other. So you've got to be pretty clever to be able to go across 3 or 4 systems inside the utility. So there's a little bit less vulnerability now just because it's not working like it should. The hope is that with strong cybersecurity protections, some people argue that even a smart grid will be less vulnerable to attack because it will be consciously designed to resist that. And I'm not enough of a cybersecurity expert to know whether we will succeed in that mission. But that's one of the big variables overhanging this and one of the big complexities for regulators. Regulators can't just go to sleep on this. They're going to have to become cybersecurity experts along with everything else they do. And that's a tough challenge for any of us. You want to take one? It's up to you on the time.
More questions? We're pretty much out of time anyway. But if not, let me thank you very much, Peter, for coming. And
thank you all. Thank you all very much. Yeah, thank you.
We're also selling copies of Peter's book, so please buy them. It should be happy to sign afterwards. And if anyone has filled out their comment cards, I or another member of the library staff can help collect them to issue that. Oh yeah, and if you didn't get food earlier, please feel free to.
Food, leftover food.